To Seqr 101, my name's Rebecca Martin, and I'm from KingstonCitizens.org, and I'm really glad you're here. There's a lot going on in the city tonight. And we are filming tonight thanks to the Kingston News. So just to make you aware of that, and you'll be able to watch this later and share with friends and whoever couldn't come. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We're getting a late start, so we'll get moving promptly. But there are bathrooms, and now there's a new procedure where there are bathroom keys up in the front. So if you have to go to the bathroom, just leave the key on the table on your way back in. We're here tonight to present Seqr 101. Seqr is the State Environmental Quality Review Act, and it's one of those things that I use all of the time to help to devise strategies and to align citizens and debate and discussion and to work with elected and appointed officials to have, when required, inclusive, transparent processes for our community. It's sometimes difficult to understand, and so I have had the great pleasure. I've been working with Jennifer O'Donnell for as long as I've been doing community work in Kingston. So I've known and worked with Jenny for 14 years, pretty much. 15 years.
14.
Jennifer,
Think about the age of our children.
Yes, we were together at the time that we were both pregnant with our sons. Jenny is, I'm just going to read a little bit of your bio. It's on the flip side. You have an agenda. Jenny has mapped out the Seqr, her presentation tonight so that you can follow along. I'll have it online for people to also have while they're looking at video. Jennifer, I just will say, to recap, is a longtime resident of the city of Kingston, traveled the world as an urban planner. She has her, and you can see her wonderful bio. She is a Columbia University graduate. She now currently works at the Department of State, where she spends her time working with municipalities to help them to understand local government and how it all works. And she's come straight from Albany today to speak with us today on Seqr. So I'm going to turn it over to Jenny, and Jenny will also give us the rundown on what to do. We really want questions throughout, so that we're not waiting to the end. So you can just raise your hand and we'll do popcorn rounds of questions when you have them. Okay? So without further ado.
Can I just grab yours since I didn't
Yeah.
have one?
Yeah. And thanks to Clark Richters from the Kingston News for always being with us and filming our meetings to share with the public. Thank you, Clark.
Hi, everyone. So, Rebecca knows me as Jenny. You can call me anything you want.
Did I say Jenny?
Yeah, that's okay. No, that's fine. That's what my friends call me. So you can call me Jenny. Seqr is never really a 101 affair. It's very complex. It's kind of deadly. It's not really a very interesting topic, and it's full of rules. And I'm not going to recite the rules, but they are in the PowerPoint that we will make available on Kingston Citizens so that you can go back and look at it. But there's a lot of really good material out there, and I put a whole list of links, which Rebecca will post with the agenda, so that you can go straight to a number of different publications. And we'll talk about those throughout the presentation. And there's one that you should have in your hands, which is a timeline. Did Jess hand that out to everyone?
If anybody doesn't have one, there's probably a couple on the back table.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I'm an urban planner, and I want to know a little bit more about you. How many of you have served on a local board? Okay. Okay, no, you serve on some boards, or attend every meeting.
I attend boards.
Several of you are board watchers, right?
No, shadow government.
Yes, right. Well, that's just great. And what did I miss? Who else is in the audience that I don't? You have a member of
Rise Up Kingston.
Rise Up Kingston. Any other organizations represented?
Transition Town, Kingston.
Oh, great! And you have a film in a few
Sequel on
days.
Thursday.
Okay, at the end maybe we'll make announcements. And
townofulstercitizens.org.
great, a birth child with
Yes.
Kingston citizens.
Kingston
The
Citizens.
New Post Climate Action Coalition.
Oh, great, great. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to walk through various sections, and I feel like it's getting so slow with questions. We'll speed it up. But if you see a topic on the list that you know is later, wait until that slide. Okay, so that way we can sort of get through it. So we're going to go through what is Seqr, what are the processes and procedures, what are some recent updates and why do we have recent updates to Seqr. We may get time to talk about case law, but I'm not sure about that. Maybe we'll just talk about 2 examples so you understand some very important concepts for Seqr. And then we're going to go through a couple of the tools and resources that you should know how to use, especially if you're a member of the board.
Jenny, I'm going to ask you to use this because
Okay.
of the air conditioning.
Oh, yeah, sure.
If you want.
Okay. Like I'm in a big auditorium. So while I do work for the Department of State, I'm here as a resident, and I wanted to just be very clear about that, about disclosing that. I'm not representing the Department of State, but I work at the Department of State where all day long we give advice to local government officials about every kind of law and regulation that concerns planning and zoning, environment, economic development, and so on. But the show is put together basically with help from the Department of Environmental Conservation, and they have a slideshow just like this online as well. But this has some variations in it because I want to emphasize certain points. I also want to point out that, as I wrote on the agenda, we will not be speaking about any current projects unless they are a matter of settled law or completed. So what is Seqr? It stands for New York State Environmental Quality Review Act. Oh, and actually, tell me by a show of hands, how many of you have never learned about Seqr? Okay. How many of you think you're intermediate? Okay. Expert? Okay. That wouldn't include me either. Okay. So there was a statute, a law, created in 1975, and then the regulations were written, which are very different because you need regulations to help an agency actually promulgate the law. You can't just follow a law. You need a whole set of procedures. And just to give you a sense of how Seqr is grounded in a whole history of environmental law, New York State had one of its very earliest regulations not regulations, but agencies that protected the environment as early as the turn of the century, the Forest and Game Commission. I think this is from the cover of their book from 1908. And the Catskill and Adirondack parks were made forever wild in 1885 in New York State. So we were very early in the environmental movement and land protection. But then there's a whole bunch of federal acts. And everyone says that the Clean Air Act of 1970 was really the beginning of our major environmental movement. And it's not because we didn't have environmental laws before, but because these really had teeth. The Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, which I didn't put in there, but it's it's 1972. There it is. And in between those two, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation was founded. And Seqr then was created in 1975, as I said, and the last update was effective in January. So I'm going to share a little bit about that with you and explain why the law continues to evolve. So what is Seqr? It is an additional review. It's not the underlying review. So if you have a project that that you're proposing or an action, you have to go through that review. And if you're required to do Seqr, it is separate. It is not in place of the review. Yeah.
I know action comes later, but you've used the term
Action. So we will define what an action is in a few minutes. And an action is anything that is proposed, because there's a lot of things that are proposed, like laws or comprehensive plans, and they're considered actions under Seqr. So Seqr, by the way, thanks for pointing that out, has a vocabulary all its own. And I printed out just 4 pages of that vocabulary, but a lot of it is available online. And we'll come back to all the vocabulary. I'll try to define each one as we go along. So it is also activated when an agency has to make a discretionary decision. So, do you know what a ministerial decision is? So the building department would be an agency that does ministerial decisions. They can say yes or no, right? They have to follow certain codes, for certain laws, the Uniform Building and Fire Prevention Code, right? But a discretionary act is when you can say only if. So you can place conditions. So that's the big difference between those kinds of acts and the acts that are carried out by planning and zoning and through Seqr. It is not, and some people may argue about other things that it is not, but it is not an additional permit. Okay, it's not actually a yes or no. It's not a green light or a red light. It is a disclosure process. So the whole point of Seqr is to actually gather information and help make whatever the approval is more informed. It's also intended to be not to be the sole consideration in decision making. So there actually are examples of times when Seqr has reached one conclusion, like for example, no problem here. Our findings are that this will not have a significant adverse environmental impact. And then a community decides, because of its own issues, that it still has environmental questions during its review, let's say for a site plan or a new other project. So, as I said before, the purpose is for gathering information, but right from the law, the main point of the purpose of Seqr is to really gather as much information into planning and decision making at the earliest possible time. That's really the main point of this. So for example, laws that, and we'll come back to this, but laws that would have an impact on more than 25 acres in a community, or comprehensive plans or zoning, you're supposed to review those under Seqr as well. And the reason is you don't want to wait until projects are proposed that might have a negative impact. You want to catch the potential environmental impact as early in any decision-making process regarding land use as early as possible. So it also covers environmental, community resources, economic development, and social impacts. And the whole idea is it's supposed to weigh these in relation to one another. I didn't want to show one of those images, with the balancing, scale, as though environment is on one side and economic is on the other, because that, I think, is a false dichotomy. The idea that you're actually saying, okay, if it's economic development, it can't be environmentally sensitive, and vice versa. If it's environmentally sensitive, it must not be good for the economy. We all know in Ulster County that that's not true, because our economy is very much based on the quality of our environment. And I just want to scale back a minute to this bigger purpose. So while I was preparing for this presentation, I pulled down the first ever global look at environmental law from the UN. It was published when? Can anybody guess? Just throw out a year.
75.
Anyone else?
1930.
Would it surprise you to know that the UN just put out its first, but those were good guesses. Although it wasn't created. Anyway, this year is the first time that they ever published a global comparison of environmental laws. And you know what? We're not ahead of the game in this country. But the main finding of that report was, and then I just thought I would show you how many languages they translated it into.
So Arabic, Chinese, or Mandarin Chinese, French, what is that, Russian, Spanish. The point is that of this report, and the main finding of this report is that that there are many pillars of democracy. Environmental law is one of them. Another one of them is freedom of access to information, freedom of the press. It by itself is not the only power to protect the environment, but also all the other forms of democracy that give citizens access to making sure that their governments are doing what is needed to protect the environment. So what are the environmental factors that Seqr considers as actually part of the law? Well, everyone would turn immediately to the bog turtle, right, which is actually right here in Ulster County and an endangered species. And one of the main reasons that these species are typically endangered when you're looking at endangered species is because they do not have space for their migratory patterns. But there are a lot of other examples of, under Seqr, under the law, that are considered legitimate, legally protected environmental factors, including wetlands, population centers, and even human health. So here are some of the things on the list, and well, you can read, right? I bring your attention to the very one at the bottom, which is community character. What does that mean to you? Anyone? Sorry?
It's culture.
Well, it can be, although it's generally looking at physical impacts, but that is generally manifested in the built environment. That's true. Sorry?
Historical.
Yes, and historical is actually one of the very specific ones on the list, but community character could even be, and there was a case, and if we can have time for case law, but I don't think we will, so I'll just work it in. There was a case in which the community character was seen to be threatened by a low-income housing development. I'll have to pull up the case law, and the court overturned that, because it said that the community character isn't threatened by having a low-income housing development in its midst, and that was one of the cases that was struck. Yes?
You said that the county building has community character?
Well, interestingly, the county office building was built before Seqr. And now it stands as a monument to modernism, I guess.
I think in Boston, on the curtain wall, which is on the outside of the building, made it mirrors.
Made it
Put
news.
Mirrors. So when you looked at the building,
Mirror, yep.
you actually saw the buildings.
It's the Hancock building. That's
Yes,
John Hancock.
well, you know, it's very interesting because, and the question was for the camera audience about the county office building, whether it has community character. Some might say that now it sort of represents a certain point in time.
It's still called the glass menagerie.
Yes, well, that's a lot of characters in there, right? So I just wanted to point out that community character, all of these things have been upheld by the courts as factors that can be considered meaningful, legitimate uses of the police power, which is a question, which is the word that's used for when you create zoning and you have the right to regulate. So these are all things that can be regulated under the law and under environmental and land use law. Oh, there it is. All of these have been upheld by the courts as a legitimate exercise of land use and environmental law. So, what is an agency? Is the Landmarks Commission an agency?
State.
Yes, it is. So any agency, an agency is any organization that has a legitimate decision-making power, and in fact, the Landmarks Commission is one of them. And what we will do is we'll get into which agencies have the ability to actually become lead agency or be an involved agency. And in this list, you have state agencies, county legislatures, town or village boards and city councils, planning boards, zoning boards of appeals, bless you, school boards, and even landmarks commissions. Any commission, any agency that has a discretionary decision to make in the process of any kind of project approval is considered an agency under Seqr. And we'll come back to that when we talk about lead agency. So, what is an action? Yes?
So, in the agency, there's involved and then there's
Yeah, we're going to talk about that too.
interested.
We're going to talk about involved and interested agencies, but for now I just wanted to define agencies. So what's interesting is that there are federal organizations, let's say like the Army Corps of Engineers. They are not agencies under Seqr because they are not a part of the Seqr process. They have their own process, which is called NEPA, which actually Seqr was modeled after. That's the National Environmental Protection Act. But I mean, they are agencies for their own purposes, but they're not agencies for the purposes of Seqr.
So NEPA is the National Environmental Protection Act. Seqr is the State Environmental Quality Review Act.
Mm-hmm.
How many states do you know in the country that have a
Not
Seqr?
as many as you'd think.
Not every
We
state
found
has
out
it.
that Connecticut had it. The strongest one is in California.
Connecticut didn't have it.
Yeah, I would say Connecticut actually does have one.
It
We
didn't.
can come back to this.
All right.
Yeah. It's
So
also
not
called,
many.
It's also called Seqr, but it starts with a C.
Mm-hmm.
New York City has one. I would say it's somewhere in the neighborhood. I knew someone was going to ask me this question, and I didn't.
But not
didn't
every
look up
state
the answer,
has
but
it.
I think it's
Not every
somewhere in
state.
the neighborhood of under 20.
Right.
So, but another thing that I just wanted to point out about the UN report, which I think is interesting, and it's also true what people are saying about environmental law in general. It doesn't really matter how strong the law is or how good you might think the law is. It has to be properly implemented. And one of the things that they found in this study for the UN is that a whole lot of them are not. And I think I kind of alluded to it. If there isn't democracy in those countries, they can have it in their constitution, but if they don't have freedom of speech, people can't protest when the law isn't being followed. Luckily, we have that ability, and Seqr has actually made it stronger with its newest iteration. So what is an action? I think I mentioned this already, and I've been through some of these points. Discretionary decision is yes, no, or only if. And direct action under Seqr is an agency can actually undertake an action. So, for example, the city council can sponsor the writing of a comp plan, and that's an action, right? So agencies can actually, they have to undergo Seqr when they are proposing a new law or a new project, let's say on one of their buildings. Even the Department of Environmental Conservation had to undergo Seqr for this law, its own law. So for 6 years, the Department of Environmental Conservation first was collecting information about the law, writing drafts of it, putting it out for public comment, scoping, etc. And it took a really long time. It took 6 years. So more typical actions are things like site plan approval, subdivision of land, special use permits, all the things that go through the planning board and sometimes the zoning board, although that's more rare, and we'll find out more about that in a minute. Yeah?
Oh, thanks. So we've got the Historic Landmarks Preservation Commission,
Yeah.
and they see applicants
Mhm.
who've often gone to the planning board as well. Sometimes haven't gone, maybe they're just there to make an exterior change to their building that's in a historic district. Do they have to declare what that would be under Seqr, a type 1, type 2? Do they do anything about Seqr?
Yes, so we're going to come back to this because the Landmarks Commission, if it's in a landmarks district or a landmark building, is an involved agency. So any agency that has a discretionary decision to make for the action at hand is considered an involved agency. And if they do not agree with it, the determination of the lead agency, and we'll come back to that as well.
Actually, no.
They can make their own determination.
But what if it's not going to the planning board or another agency at all? What if it's just the Historic Landmarks Preservation Commission that says, say for example, has somebody come before them where they're just making a change to the exterior of their building. They're not required to go to planning for that. In that case, in the case of an example,
It would probably not be an action under Seqr because it's very small.
because it's small, so then the size.
Yeah, the size does matter in Seqr,
Okay.
so we'll come back to that.
Thanks.
Okay. But most of the time, unless you're dealing with a sign or in-kind work on a facade, and now we're getting into landmarks. I was a landmarks commissioner for 3 years. Then it's not generally not going to go. Then it's generally going to go to the building department. To the planning board. So the planning board sees a lot of projects that go to the landmarks commission, but there are certain projects that would only go to landmarks commission, and those are so small that they would probably not be subject to Seqr. And there may be some exceptions, but actually, because the law has now tried to support more historic preservation, those are actions that are not, don't require the full Seqr. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But that's a good question. So, Seqr timeline. You have a timeline there, and it's a little bit hard to read, but I want to walk you through the time frame and then the timeline. You don't have that one, you have the other one. Let me talk a little bit about this one, and then we'll get to the one that you do have. But if you look up the one that you have in your hand, you'll see that on the back of it is this timeline. And what this timeline simply does, and we're going to go through all of this as quickly as we can, but when someone proposes an action or a project, they submit an environmental assessment form, and then there's this establishment of the lead agency. We're going to go through each one of these. 30 days, determination of significance, up to 20 days, but there are exceptions to this, and we'll talk about that.
I'm sorry to interrupt Jenny again, but who determines the type of action? Is it the applicant that does that, or
No,
is it
the law. So we'll get to that too.
Okay.
And then there's this whole process with the, if it's in fact considered a project that might have a significant adverse environmental impact, the timeline continues. I don't want to bore you with this timeline, but just to show you that there are very clear steps in the timeline, and generally speaking, some of them are flexible, some of them are not, and this is why I wanted to show it to you, because there's a whole period of time when the sponsor, the proposer of the project, can simply take his or her time. And other ones where the turnaround is absolutely necessary within a prescribed period of time. And all of that is on our slides as we continue on. So let's not get into the weeds there. I just wanted to point that out to you. So the next one is the one you're holding. And we're going to talk about every single one of these, including the determination of significance and how it's determined, how it's classified, whether it has to go through Seqr, the full Seqr or not. The trouble with Seqr is it's like a circle, like a snake eating its own tail. You can't really talk about it until you've come up with all the definitions. But while you're trying to define one, you're talking about another one. So it gets very complicated. But the point of this timeline, and the reason I wanted you to have a copy of it, is because Seqr can end in several places, 4 places in particular. Is it subject to Seqr? If it's not, then it ends and there's no Seqr. So that's the first place it can end. Is it a type 2 action? And we'll get into what type 2 actions are. If it is, Seqr ends and there's no full environmental impact statement. But if it's a type 1 action or an unlisted action and the law defines what those are, then you have to go into an environmental assessment process and then at a certain point determine whether or not the lead agency, we'll talk about what the lead agency is and who that is, they will determine whether or not it requires the full environmental impact statement. And if it does not require one, then the process ends. But If a full environmental impact statement is required, then you have a much lengthier process, and we're going to go through each one of these steps. And once the agency, each agency, including every involved agency, so let's say the Landmarks Commission is involved in a process, they have to make their findings at the end of the process, as well as the lead agency, which is typically the planning board, but we'll come back to that. So, and then everyone makes their findings, and then the process ends, and then the process continues for the applicant through, let's say, planning board, let's say site plan approval. You can't, until the process is complete, Seqr process is complete, you can't actually complete the other underlying review that's required.
Jenny?
Yeah.
How do public funds fit into a project with Seqr? When are public funds available to a project?
So we saw this with the Niagara bottling project where we looked into that. The law says that public funds can't be expended until the Seqr is complete. However, there are many times when funds are, grants are made available, awarded, but they're not allowed to, the state, according to Seqr, the state is not allowed to actually give the funds until the Seqr process is complete. So it's murky, but let's say that Seqr, the determination is so such a bombshell that the planning board might decide not to, in fact, approve the project. At that point, if the project is not approved, the money might go away if it's public money, because it can't be expended if the Seqr process doesn't determine that it would have no significant adverse environmental impact. But it's a much longer discussion. So, but grants get made all the time, awards get made all the time before the Seqr process is done, because it's sort of a chicken and egg thing. How would you actually start a project if you didn't have grant funding, and how would you get through Seqr if you didn't even have a project? So you're going to apply before you ever have a project. Yes, Tanya.
So there's a positive declaration of environmental impact and a negative
Yeah.
declaration, and that's step 5 after informing the agencies, the interested and involved. But at that point, when they're weighing in whether they agree to the proposed lead agency, is that the time for them to give their feedback for whether it should be a positive or negative declaration? And also, I have an attached question with that
We
too.
will get to that on a later slide, but go on. What's the next question?
What stuck out to me here is it says each agency makes its findings part of
Yes.
part of the final steps.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole idea of coordinated review. I find the idea of coordinated review really confusing.
Yes, and we're going to talk about that too. It's all on the list of the agenda. So my suggestion is that if you look at the agenda and you have a question about something that's coming up, that's why I provided the list rather than 60 slides. If you see it coming up on the list, wait until I'm actually dealing with that topic.
Okay.
But that's okay, because like you've just proven that it's really one of those things. Unless you know one thing, it's hard to know the other. So what we'll do in the wrap-up is we'll go back, and if there's any questions about something that wasn't clear, we'll go back. So this again is that same timeline. Now I've simplified this. So the agency proposes an action. The action is classified. We're going to talk about that. Anywhere where you see an asterisk, and we're going to look at this over and over throughout the presentation. I'll just come back to this image. Anywhere where you see an asterisk, the process can end. Okay? Just keep that in mind. Don't try to remember the rest. So right now we're on the agency proposes an action or receives an application. So you're the planning board for the city of Kingston, and you either propose a new comprehensive plan, right, or you receive an application for a project. So as this says, if it's subject to Seqr, the agency should look at this as early as possible, because they can't make any other approvals if Seqr is involved. So I've already talked a little bit about an agency action. So an agency action could be, for example, Ulster County wants to buy a new park or an open space, piece of open space, and because it's available and they want to turn it into a park. They want to spend their own money on it. They're subject to Seqr, right? Let's see, on the other side, agency receives an application, so it could be for the review of anything. The review of state and local permits, of state and local highway access. And we'll talk about a case in Long Island if we have time. And even the review and approval for grants, but yes.
The Kingston Land Trust, say that they had a property that they wanted to turn into a green space. Would that be big enough to be under this?
It depends on, well, see, they're not an agency, so when they buy the land, they don't need to undergo Seqr. Only when they propose some kind of change to the land that is subject to Seqr. So if it's a project larger than a certain size, and these thresholds are all described in the environmental assessment form.
So the
And in
sizes
the law.
are in the specific law?
So if they, for example, let's say they have a piece of land that's 10 acres and they're in a historic district, or there's critical environmental resources there, and they're going to do something that, as we'll see, is on the type 1 list, or not listed, but potentially has a negative adverse environmental impact, then a potential adverse environmental impact, then they would be subject to Seqr as a type 1 or unlisted. We'll go through the list.
And that was hypothetical. I was thinking small versus large.
So the agency has to classify the action. A lot of this is redundant, so, and I've already said this, they cannot act they can't approve a site plan before getting through Seqr. That's the point of that. So now we're going to talk about how you classify the action. You asked about that, right? So the law sets the basic requirements. What is type 1, what is type 2, and it asks you to look at the environmental assessment form and fill that out. And what's great about it, we'll go through it in a few minutes, is that the environmental assessment form is online. It's connected to an online mapper full of data about every single issue that we just talked about, every layer of wetlands and water resources and historic resources. Everything is in there. So if you look up an address on the environmental mapper, it will populate your environmental assessment form for you and tell you whether there might be a potential sensitive resource that could be impacted. So what is type 1?
Jen,
Yeah.
you're saying if you input like the SBL or something, or
Oh, the address.
it just gives everything.
It will create a report for you. Yeah, isn't that amazing? And that came online in 2013.
I don't want to get off topic because where you're going, but I've found that the mapper sometimes has flaws.
Sometimes it probably does.
And so I think that there's a DEC, what do you call it, disclaimer.
Yes, there is a disclaimer.
Right.
Yeah.
So for people who are filling it
Yeah.
out to know that
Yeah.
it's good to also review what pops up.
Right, so
It's not a
Rebecca
given
raises a
thing.
really important point.
Okay.
2 really important points. If you are the applicant, you cannot rely on
You're
that.
responsible
Legally,
for
you're responsible
the language.
for the information that you provide to the agency. The agency, in turn, is 100% responsible for vouching for the accuracy and adequacy,
The lead agency.
the lead agency, of the data that they receive. So if they don't feel that it's accurate, they do not have to believe, for example, the applicant. They have to, because they are ultimately responsible. Who is responsible for any decision that they make in the public sector? The government.
Would the environmental assessment form, if there was a need for correction, be sent back to the applicant to
Yes.
correct before the process begins?
Well, yeah, generally speaking, that's a dialogue between the agency and the applicant, or what's referred to as the project sponsor. So let's just very quickly look at this. Type 1 requires a long environmental assessment form. Type 1 is the project that any action that's presumed to have a potential impact, okay? They have to do what is called a long environmental assessment form, and they are required to do a coordinated review, or at least that's generally the way it goes. Unlisted, it's optional, the coordinated review. Unlisted means the law does not list it is a type 1 or a type 2. And they can use a short or long environmental assessment form, depending on the scope of the project. And type 2, well, Seqr's over if you're a type 2. Now, all this raises a really important question, which was raised by Rebecca's question. The applicant and lead agency have to vouch and certify for their work. So it's not an approval process, as I said. It's all about accuracy of information, information gathering, disclosure. So, and another point behind this is that the law is self-enforcing, they call it, self-enforcing, which means that there's no individual agency that is responsible for enforcing it. If somebody feels that the process, it wasn't accurately done, they have to take it up. And one of the interesting things that, and this is why I do this kind of reading, one of the interesting things about this UN report is that there are people in the United States calling for laws that do not make it required that you have to have a whole boatload of money, or that you have to have standing. This is the debate. Standing means that you have to be specifically impacted by the action. In many countries now, anyone could bring a suit against what could be potentially an environmental impact or environmental, like something that's illegal in the environment. In the United States, we do not have that yet. You have to have standing and have to be near or somehow be determined to be someone who has the right to bring a lawsuit. That's considered to be a lower threshold than many countries are now putting into their laws. Yeah.
But if one of the caveats is community character, or one of the breaks that
They're all heavy.
don't you have standing if you're being influenced because the community?
Well, so yeah, it's really interesting, and again, much longer discussion. Who has standing? It generally you have to be within a certain distance or district, or demonstrate that you are negatively impacted in some what's the word, tangible way, right? It can't just be, for example, that you're hurt by it, or that you're affected by it intangibly. It's very complicated, and I would love that to be Seqr 201, that we talk about those topics, because I think it's very interesting, but it's probably for another day. But it's also true that in a zoning case, for example, if you're in the next zoning district and the zoning board of appeals approves something that you don't agree with, if you're not within the, I guess you could say, the distance of that district that would, it's very difficult because I'm not a lawyer, but I do play one on TV. If you're not in the same zoning district, or you're not within a certain distance, or you can't demonstrate actual harm, then you can't grieve what the zoning board of appeals decides. So standing is a very specific issue. So we'll get back to that another time. So segmentation, how many of you heard that term? So segmentation is something that has to be avoided, and again, we encountered this, I don't mind saying, in the Niagara process, because what segmentation actually is when an action is proposed and it doesn't either disclose or explain or demonstrate or apply for approval for all the parts of the project that it needs to be functional. So if you're, let's say, a water bottling plant and you need a reservoir to be functional, you have to demonstrate the impacts on the reservoir, not just the construction of the plant. So that was where, when we were looking at that, we understood that unless they showed all aspects of the process in their environmental assessment form, including the source, they could be guilty of segmentation. We didn't get that far, and it was not an issue, but that would have been segmentation. So that's just an example that everybody's heard about here.
Yeah, another example of segmentation when GlidePath was proposing, and they submitted their EAF1, Part 1 long form. They left blank the whole section on emissions. And we confronted them on that. We didn't know it was called that there was any pertinence to segmentation or not. We said, you left this out. I mean, you're burning fossil fuels. Anyway,
So-
part two, the lead agency filled it in, but they filled it in with greater than maybe 1.0 something.
Right.
So it was a million, but.
So that's actually not an example of segmentation, but it's a good example of the responsibility of the lead agency, and they fulfilled their responsibility by saying, if you leave something out on your form, we're the ones who have to vouch for it when we do our findings.
Well, that is not segmentation then.
So segmentation is when you have two parts of a project that need each other to be functional and they're not proposed together. So the example here, but that is an example of where if you left that out and the agency just went forward and didn't verify the adequacy and accuracy of the data, then they would be very foolish to approve the project, right?
Yeah.
Jenny, where is the action in the application? Where would you find that? For
Where's the
example,
action? The action is listed right at the beginning of the environmental assessment form, and we're going to look at the environmental assessment form together. And I don't want us to,
we're good.
we're good. So here's an example of what might be considered segmentation. If you proposed a very large, let's say you proposed, well, this is actually not an example of segmentation. A phased project is not an example of segmentation so long as you are showing all the parts of the process that you intend to incorporate. So if, for example, you went for subdivision approval and you said you were really only going to build this much, and ultimately what you wanted was to build this much, that would be an example of segmentation.
So,
Hi.
so if a developer comes before a planning board and presents a lead agency and presents phase one, and that goes through, it's approved, and the project begins, it's underway, and then they discover or they want to come back and say, well, actually, we're going to connect another project.
So the courts found in a case that might have looked like segmentation, that it wasn't segmentation, when there was an incinerator proposed in a community, and later there was another waste, I think it was, well, I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly, I think it was another type of waste management aspect to that facility, because they didn't know, they knew that they might want to do it later and might want to incorporate different technologies, but they didn't propose it in the beginning, and that was not found to be segmentation, although it was charged to be segmentation. So you have to look at each case to see whether or not, for example, if there was any intention of incorporating it, or it was actually needed, and this is the word that you should have to consider, to be functional. So it didn't need a composting facility to be an incinerator, right? So it was okay for them to have two different, projects in there, and it wasn't seen as segmentation. But if you needed, for example, I'm trying to think, if you needed to cut down a whole row of trees in order to develop this site and fully, and you hadn't disclosed that you were doing it, then the environmental impact might have seemed to be less in the first application, which is why you want to look at the whole piece of property and the whole action. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Thank you.
Sure. There's a whole bunch of case law in the Seqr handbook on segmentation. So I can show it to you later. I have it actually with me. So let's go through the types of projects. Yes.
Speaking of the handbook, what they have online that I found is a draft. It's very hard to read with a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it has the
crossed
word
out.
draft behind every page.
Yeah, is there something new? Is
No.
No, in fact, it's not, because it was updated on January 1st, 2019, thank God. There's a whole bunch of new stuff in here. You're right, it is a little hard to read. What I would do is if I'm looking at a section that's hard to read, and it probably isn't, easy for people who, might have vision issues, but what I would suggest is download it and then cut and paste the wording that you need, or search the word in the PDF. Like search for words.
And the crossed out stuff is old and it's no good anymore.
Cross-outs mean it's no longer a part of the law,
Okay.
right?
Jenny, sorry, but the reason it's a draft is because they're still making changes to it, right?
Well, no, they're not making changes. So here's the thing about the Seqr handbook. The Seqr handbook is 200 and something pages long, maybe even more. And every time a new question comes in that's very legitimate or very valuable case law comes in that they want to update the book with, you just add to the book. So the book is kind of an online compendium of questions. And I think it is one of the best things out there, even though it's very long and complicated, because you can go right to the question that you're interested in. You just have to search in the PDF. So, but there are so many handy tools online, and they're on the back of your page. And what we'll do, again, is we'll post the agenda online so everyone can go to the things that we recommend visiting. So, type 2 actions. I'm going to go through, like, how you determine, how this is now called the classification. We're classifying the action now. We're really early in the timeline. So, Type 2 is determined not to require an environmental impact statement. And there's a whole bunch of things, but some of the examples are, like you said about the historic properties, maintenance and repair, upgrade, let's say to meet building code or fire code. So very simple upgrades that require only a ministerial decision, right? Single family homes on approved lots, non-residential under 4,000 square feet. And there's a whole bunch. There are 54 type 2 actions listed in the law. So if you go visit the law, you can see it. And that's up from 37 that were listed up until now. And I will show you some of the new ones and why that changed. So that concludes Seqr if you are a type 2 action. And it's very important for the agency to keep a record. If they decide that it's a type 2 action, they have to say why. And they have to write that, and they have to keep that record forever, basically, so that people can look at it. So records are a very big part of Seqr and any land use law, any law, period. Type 1 is more likely to have a significant adverse environmental impact, and these are listed in the law. And sometimes the thresholds are lower for historic properties, parkland and open space and agricultural districts for specific reasons. For example, with agricultural districts, it's because this is a place where we want to encourage the working farm economy, and so we want to make sure that farmers have a little bit more latitude on their land, so long as they're actually undergoing what would be considered an appropriate review process. Some of the thresholds are lower. The same is true for wanting to see historic buildings saved and restored. So there are a lot of really good reasons in the law for each action and why it's classified as a type 1. So the requirements for review are a coordinated review. We'll talk about that and how the agencies have to work together, and that they must use a full environmental assessment form. Unlisted actions fall between the two. So they might be a little bit larger than a type 2, and they might not be on the type 1 list. In other words, unlisted. So some examples would be a 20-unit apartment building, because you're supposed to be over, I believe it's, it depends on the size of the community, but I believe it's over 100 units, which create a certain, let's say, traffic impact. So that's a threshold in the environmental assessment form. So non-residential use less than 10 acres. You talked about the land trust. Let's say they buy a 10-acre parcel of land and they want to do something, and there's a critical environmental area there. So, or there's a piece of property there. Depending on how that area is classified, not classified, but what are the sensitivities of that area. They might be an unlisted action because the agency says, you know what, you're sitting on top of an aquifer, or you have an incredibly valuable historic property there, or you're in a brownfield, or whatever it is, but they may say you're an unlisted action because we want to make sure that there's no environmental impact regarding your project. So the agency has the opportunity to decide that, and the law is very clear about those thresholds as well. And we can't go into all the details, but I really urge you to look at the environmental assessment form. It's one of the, we're going to spend a little time with it so you understand it, and then you could go back to it and understand why certain things might be classified as unlisted. Okay? Let's move on. So the lead agency, how do we establish the lead agency? Well, an involved agency is the body that directly undertakes the action. So it's usually the one that receives the application. I'm sorry to keep moving back and forth, Clark. You're good? Okay,
I'm
thanks.
gonna have to give you a time, like,
Okay,
I wanna restart the tape.
okay, let me know. Oh, you want to do that now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Any questions